Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. We have the pleasure of having one of our Innovia team members with us, Ramin Margi. He is one of our application consultants and will be presenting on I've Got the Power Query. Catchy title, I think. And as a reminder, we are recording this webinar and we will post it to our on-demand library for you to review again or share with anyone. And you can find our library under our resources tab on our website at innovia.com. And we do encourage you to ask questions during our presentation. So please feel free to type them into the questions box and we will answer them at the end of our session. So now I'm going to turn it over to Ramin to kick off our presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Angie. All right. So hi, everyone. My name is Ramin, and I'm a bean counter by training. So I'm an accountant based in Canada. I'm a CPA, but I've been working in the Microsoft space for a while now. I first began as a user of Nav, so working client side back in 2011. Then I switched over to the dark side, and I began working as a VAR, or basically a partner consultant, since 2014. So it's been almost a decade now. I've tried on many different hats, in that space. Done a bit more of the project-oriented work, so implementations, upgrades, etc. But I'd say I've spent the lion's share of time on the rescue side of things, so in support, as well as doing a bunch of coding in Cal and AL and reporting. So Jet reports, Power BI, Power Query, etc. I wanted to conduct today's webinar because honestly, I feel like Power Query and the Power Query engine in Excel is quite possibly the most underrated and underappreciated aspect of Excel. So I thought it deserved a little bit of time in the limelight there. So what is Power Query? Power Query is functionality that's baked into Excel itself. It is an engine. Almost everyone in this space has heard of Power BI, and I'm a huge evangelist for Power BI. I love the product. I love the suite of the Power Platform, but I think sometimes it takes all the air or attention away from what is literally one of the OGs when it comes to the Power Platform. So Power Query actually first debuted in Excel 2010, so it's been around quite a while. But again, most people haven't heard of it or used it. So I'm out here on my soapbox trying to rectify that. Power Query is, as I've said before, an engine. Specifically, it's an ETL engine. So the ETL is a abbreviation of extraction, transformation, and loading. And we'll drill into each of those components in today's webinar. I'd rather show you than tell you, so I won't have much on that in this slides, really. And it is important to note that it's the exact same engine that powers Power BI. So if you learn Power Query in Power BI, you've effectively learned Power Query in Excel. If you learn Power Query in Excel, you've effectively learned Power Query in Power BI. It's so interchangeable that you can actually copy your queries back and forth between Power BI Desktop and Excel. It's kind of crazy. Some kind of magic there. Okay, so let's get started. In today's session, I'm going to work off of a premise. The premise is that I want a financial report from my Business Central or Nav instance. Specifically, I want GL data. Having said that, you're not limited to GL data. You can surface subledger details. So if you want to pull inventory reports, AP, AR type reports, totally doable. Just follow the same motions. It's effectively the same. I start with GL because it's really baseline. Everyone has some need for GL. It's also the easiest to really demonstrate. So I also want to have a dynamic and easy to use report. So I need it to be responsive. I need to be able to reformat it, change the way it looks. I want to be able to use slicers, filters, etc. I also want to be able to refresh it on demand. So I don't want a static report. I want something that I can refresh, grab new data from. And I want it to be in Excel. Power BI is great. It has paginated reports too, printable stuff, but a lot of times you want your data in Excel because you want to do some ad hoc, off the side of the napkin kind of calculation stuff. So I'm going to be working in Excel, and that's really where Power Query, I think, shines. All right. I always like to start with the end in mind when it comes to reporting. So I like to start with a mock-up or even just a draft of what information I might want. So if I'm building financial reports, easy enough. Typically, you have GL accounts. GL accounts across rows. Usually, when it comes to financial statements, maybe across columns, I want my comparatives year over year, or maybe I want to have dimensions. So maybe I want departments to pull like a departmental P&L or something like that. And the intersection of the two should be giving me some dollar amounts, which obviously come from the general ledger. So the recipe for that, so basically now identifying all the key pieces that I want to report on. I want to pull the GL accounts. I want to be able to group them together, do filtering for balance sheet or income statement accounts, all that good stuff, roll up and drill down and all that. I want my dimension values, so I want to have my departments, my regions, whatever your dimensions may be. I want to pull that stuff in. Then I want to have the actual GL entries where the amounts are stored, where the posting dates are stored, and all that kind of stuff is tied together, right? So with that, let's jump right in there. So here I am in my demo company, appropriately called Awesome Sauce Incorporated. And in case you're wondering, yes, I did go so far as to create a logo for this company too. I'm kind of crazy like that. But in here, I posted some sample data. So the numbers may seem a little weird. When you use randomized data, even though it's randomized, it all looks pretty uniform. In any event, so I'm here in Business Central. So one thing to note is that when you're in Business Central or Nav, the whole thing is database driven. So there is a database in the background that's storing data. But as an end user, we interact with pages. So even though I'm on the chart of accounts page and I'm seeing GL account, so rather I'm on chart accounts, I can see GL account numbers. This data is stored in tables in the database, but is surfaced via pages. The reason why this is important is that you can't consume tables directly in the cloud using something other than Jet Reports, which lets you do that. So you do have to publish pages out and consume them in Power Query. This will all make sense in a few moments, so bear with me. This is probably the most tedious aspect of the webinar. But in any event, yeah, so here I am on this chart of accounts page. And you can find out your page ID by looking up here in the address bar. You can see a little page equals and a little number next to it. Or you can do Control-Alt-F1 on your keyboard, and that lets you peek under the hood and see what it is you're looking at. You can also find it by going to Help, and then Help and Support, and then Inspect, Page Inspector, all that kind of stuff. So, but in any event, so I'm on this page. It shows me the fields that are on the page. It tells me the page number, which is important because I want to know exactly which page it is that I'm looking at. It also shows me the underlying page, table ID. Kind of pro tip here, in case you ever want to look at the table data, you can click View Table, and it does open the table in the background, so you can actually run the table effectively. But in any event, I'm going to make a note of this, page 16. I do need to keep track of that, so I'm just going to paste that here in Notepad, because that's where I'm going to go to pull things like the account type, income balance, the category, all that good stuff. Drilling into these amounts, this is the underlying data. This is where the actual amounts are stored. And this is page number 20. So this is from the GL entry table. I'm going to make note of this as well. I'm going to paste that right here. So that's two of the pieces of the recipe that I was talking about, where we have the GL accounts and we have the GL entries. The last bit that I want to pull in are my dimensions. So if I go to the dimensions page, this is just the high level dimensions that I have set up. What I really want are the values. So these are the stuff that get posted down to the general ledger that I want to surface in my Power Query report so I can then slice and dice and filter and all that good stuff. It also allows me to do things like show the name in slicers instead of just the code, because some of your codes might be numeric and might not make much sense to end users, whereas the name is very, very easy to read, right? So this is page 537. Again, make a note of that. And now I have all the constituent pieces that I need for my report. In order to consume these over the web, in order to refresh it and pull it into my Power BI or Power Query report, I do need to go to the Web Services section of Business Central or Nav. And when you go in there, you're going to see that there's a lot of stuff already in there. This is all out of the box stuff that Nav and Business Central publish for various reasons. Some of them are used in exporting stuff to Excel reports. Some of them are used in certain APIs, event management, all that kind of good stuff. Some of them are actually, they have some out-of-the-box Power BI queries and pages already published too. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to make my own. So I just click on New here, and the type is going to be page. And I took a note of my pages, so I'm going to publish the chart of accounts first. So that's page 16. And then you have to give it a little bit of a name. Even though technically you can have spaces in the service name, I don't like doing that. I don't think it's great practice because, you know, URLs get encoded with like % signs and stuff like that to handle that. So I just like to give it a nice kind of prefix, usually, you know, customer abbreviation or INBC for Novia Consulting or something like that. But let's go ahead and give this a name, chart of accounts. It is case sensitive when you consume these, so just remember the smart casing you used. And then finally, you click on the publish button. When you do that, the system generates a URL for this, and that's what we're going to basically copy paste into Excel. But I do have two other queries that are two other pages that I want to publish. There is the GL entries. Oops. So I'm going to go ahead and put those in here as well and publish that. Then I'm also going to do my dimension values. Again, this will all make sense in a short while. So bear with me here and bear with my inability to spell. Okay, I have these three, so I can go ahead and I can copy the link. And the area we go to in Excel to paste that is under this data tab. You'll see that there's this get and transform section. So the get is effectively the E in ETL, extraction, and then this transformation. We'll get to the loading in the end when we deal with the data model. But the great thing about this functionality is that you don't have to only get OData over the internet. So you can actually connect to things like SAP HANA databases directly to a SQL database. You can pull from flat files that you may have. I've seen some companies, they keep their budgeting out of the system. They might have their budgets in static sheets somewhere. Not the best practice, but it's a thing. You can get from CSV files, so you might have exports from your bank or something like that you want to pull in. You could pull from SharePoint, Microsoft Dynamics CRM. You could pull a whole bunch of different stuff in here. What we're going to really focus on is the OData feed. OData is the protocol over the internet, by the way, that's used to basically manage APIs and interoperable queries and all that kind of stuff. So you just can kind of come in here and basically connect to those over the internet. I don't think the copy paste kind of worked there, so I'll do that again. There we go. So if I were to lop off the service name at the end, we can actually browse all the existing queries that are in there. Ordinarily, you may need to sign in. I'm already signed in, so that's why it kind of skipped the authentication. You'll have to do the sign in when that kind of pops up initially. Now, if I look in here, I can see all these names across the left. We should be able to see the webinar ones that I published by just basically scrolling down. When you click on each of these, it does show you a little preview of the data that's being published out. And you see there's a lot of fields on there. Let's go ahead and pull in our chart of accounts. When we want to pull it in, you can just click into the table and it pulls that in. This query, by default, comes up with a query name. You can rename it by right-clicking and renaming it here, or you can just change the name up here. I'm going to call it chart of accounts. You can then also go and I'll go grab the rest of them. So right-clicking, new query, OData feed. What were my other ones called? Let's pull in dimension values. I think that's what I called that one. Oh, maybe it's not called dimension values. Dimension value, singular. My bad. We go in here and grab that data, dimension value. And it shows you, again, a preview of the data. You click OK, and it creates that second query. I'm going to call this dimension values. And then we'll get our third one, which are the GL entries. It does a little song and dance. Now, GL entries does take a little bit longer than the others because there's clearly a lot more data, or hundreds of thousands of records sometimes, in some databases more. And then it pulls that in. So we'll just call this GL entries. So this page we're on is called the Power Query Editor. The extraction piece is just that. We got the data. It's the E in ETL. We get the data, all your different sources, whether it's flat files, web pages, OData feeds, databases, all that kind of stuff. They all get kind of housed in this area, this staging area where we can play around with it. Now we can move on to the T section of transformation. So you'll notice that on the right-hand side, there's a section called Applied Steps. As you do things to your query, it will begin to save your steps. It's almost like a macro. And you'll see what that looks like in a second. So one thing I might want to do is I might want to pare down my query here so I don't have to do a lot of scrolling. I want the GL account number, name. I want my dimension 1 and 2. I'm just holding control to do multi-select. I want the amount. I probably want the user ID just for audit purposes. Maybe the source code, actually, why not? And external document number, and any other dimensions I may have. So I just have 3 of them set up, so I don't need to keep going. But you can right-click, remove other columns, and then it's going to pare down this this query to the columns that I selected. So you can see here, again, so it added a step called removed other columns. So basically every time you refresh the report, refresh basically the spreadsheet, it'll go through and apply each of these steps. So you could have hundreds of them here if you want to create custom columns, if statements, maybe you want to multiply the amount by -1 if it's a revenue account, all this kind of stuff. One of our clients wanted to have basically the ability to report in different currencies. So we have like a currency factor for them that looks up basically the exchange rate they want to use, multiplies the amount and into a column called amount to use, for example. So there's a lot of flexibility with these steps that you can do, to get that all in there. We'll do the same thing with our chart of accounts. I just want to pare it down to the bare minimum. So this is going to be a lookup table effectively for, actually I don't really need that, for me, so I don't need all the extra columns that are in there. There was already a balance field in there, but I don't need just the balance of date. I want to be able to change the dates and figure out the balance as of a specific date. So I have my chart of accounts, I have my GL entries, looking good. So I know I'm going to link this GL account number to the GL account number in here. I have my dimensions all in here in my dimension values query. But I might want to do some stuff with this because right now I have multiple columns in my GL entries query for dimensions. Each one is its own separate column. If I were to make a link between one column and the code here, I would be just filtering off of one single dimension. I don't want that. I want my dimensions, I want to be able to filter my dimensions separately. So I'm going to actually basically create multiple versions of this. First and foremost, I just want standard dimensions. I don't want my begin and end totals. And I can now reference this. I'm going to reference it and filter this just for departments. So this is now my lookup table for departments. I'm going to call this dimension department. I'm going to do the same thing for my other 2 dimensions. I'm going to do region, dimension region. This will all make sense when we get to the actual report, and I'm creating slicers because we want to relate each dimension to separate columns. So sales channel, cool. So I've got all my queries in here that I need. So we've done the E, we've done the T. The T is all these transformations that we've done. And now we do the L, the loading. So if I just click close and load, what it will do is it will load them all into Excel. So you'll see there's different sheets here with all the values from that. If all I wanted was a list or separate lists, then my job's done. That's all in here anyway. And again, you'll see that it's, as I'm loading them in, it's actually loading, the entries in there. So this is already refreshing the data, and you can see I have 17, almost 18,000 GL entries that I'm working off of. Again, if that's all all I cared about, if all I wanted was just these lists, my job would be done. So this is good if you have if you want to create a vendor list that's refreshable, that's all you really need to do. But I want to report. I want to create relationships between these. I want to do some calculations, some summarization. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to delete all these sheets. And what that'll do is I'll switch these all to connection only. So for each of these, I can actually right-click load to, and I can do this nifty little thing called adding to a data model. When I add it to the data model, it basically will store that information in a separate engine in Excel itself, and it will allow me to do things like create relationships, do calculations. And again, that's all going to make sense because we're going to do that. But I'm adding these to this data model so I can then pull what's called a power pivot. So it's like a pivot table on steroids, basically. It's where we're going to go to do interesting calculations that are context driven. And because of relationships, it'll let me basically, flexibly and dynamically report on my data without having to do things like VLOOKUPs or sum ifs or anything like that. We create the relationships, and then once the relationships are in there, it just knows. It's kind of bizarre and magical when you go through it the first time. It blows your mind, really. So fasten your seatbelts. We're about to get to the good part. All right. Now that we've loaded to data model, we want to go to our data model. Where you can find that is in the data tab. There's this manage data model button. You click on that and it opens up this page called Power Pivot. I can see all my queries in here, all the queries that I loaded to data model, and I can go up to the design tab and I can actually create relationships. So let's create our relationships. I'm going to tell it that in the GL entries query, the GL account number is related to the chart of accounts number. So I'm creating the one-to-many kind of map here. It does a little song and dance. And then I'm going to also say, okay, in the GL entries query again, global dimension 1 is department. So we go ahead and we relate the global dimension 1 to the code from the department. And we're going to do the same thing for the rest of our dimensions. Global dimension 2 is my region dimension. And global dimension, or shortcut dimension, I should say, 3 is going to be my sales channel. Now that I've created this relationship, when I go into, I can save this and close it. I can come into Excel and I can insert a pivot table from our data model itself. This is going to look very familiar if you've ever worked with pivot tables. The difference is I can now pick from multiple data sources, right? Multiple queries within my data model. So if in a standard pivot table, you normally just have a single field selector based on a table or something like that. But here I have multiple data sources that I can pick from. And because I've related them, I can interchangeably put, or I can cherry pick fields from different queries. So if I go to my chart of accounts, I pull in the account category, the number, and the name, let's say, and let's switch this to a tabular view. Much better. I can then go into my GL entries. So again, I pulled these fields from this query up here. Now I'm coming down to this query down here, and I can pull in the amount. And let's format this because I'm a stickler for formatting. Accounting, no decimals, no symbol. There we go. So already as it is, this is a pretty neat kind of functionality, right? I can come in and I can add my slicers. So let's go ahead and add slicers for department name, let's say region name, sales channel name. And because I've set those up as independent queries, but related to the dimension columns, I can say finance, I could say Arizona, I could say government. So you can see here how powerful this can be because I'm pulling, again, completely separate data tables, if you want to call them that. So fact tables and dimension tables. And it just knows because we create the relationship on the fly, it does all the calculation and summarization, which is fantastic. And obviously this is a pivot table. You've used a pivot table before, so I'm assuming. So you could do all of like the fun stuff. You can add a chart and all that kind of stuff. To here, you can reformat it and add subtotals and all that good stuff. But what we'll do is we're going to take it to the next level now at this point. We've created the relationships. Oh, and just one thing, before adding like a date filter or timeline, you can double click and drill down and see, the underlying data that makes up that amount, just like a normal pivot table. But one kind of weird thing with Power Pivot for some reason is once you add in timeline, the drill down functionality kind of goes away. But you can also just pull a separate table for that, so it's not the end of the world. But you can see here again, with multiple dimensions, multiple basically filtering syntaxes. I guess there's nothing in that. You can have this dynamic report, more or less, right? And maybe one thing we want to do, actually, we'll do that right now, is let's filter for just income statement accounts. There we go. So now we have a little bit of a P&L, if you will, by dimension, by date, and all that good stuff. I'm kind of a fan of having my slicers be different colors. It can look a little tacky sometimes, but it's also kind of nice. I don't know. So far, hopefully you're following. Hopefully this makes sense. Hopefully you can see the power of the capabilities. But we're now going to take it again to the next level. One thing you might want to do is do calculations, right? So it's great that we have our income, our expenses, our COGS. That's all nice, but you may want to do some computation, right? So although this technically gives me, net income more or less, because the sum of all these would effectively be net income. You might want gross profit. You might want, I don't know. You might want to do some gross profit percentages or something like that. So what we could do is we can add what are called measures. So a little bit of a sidebar. In the background of Power Query is actually some code that runs. So you don't have to learn the code. You could just use the buttons just like I did when I did that. But when it comes to measures, there's a different language called DAX. And if you've used Power BI, DAX makes sense. It's very similar to Excel formulas, to be honest. It's slightly different. So we're going to build some DAX measures, do some calculations here. So I can pick, really I could put it virtually anywhere, but I'm going to add a measure to the chart of accounts, and I'm going to call this one total revenue. This will make sense why I'm doing it here, because it's nice to have it kind of be more of a master data level as opposed to like a transactional level. But basically, I'm gonna do total revenue, and revenue by default is a credit, so it's in minus sign. So I'm gonna do -1 times calculate the sum, not the sum of amount, say calculate the sum of the amount field. And what's my filter? So I'm calculating the sum of a completely different query based on the filter of a different query, but because there's a relationship, it'll know what I'm talking about. Where the account category is equal to income. I'm going to copy this because I'm going to probably reuse this, a similar formula for all my other measures there. I want this to be a currency, and I click OK. And now, if I go, I can insert from my data model. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to put my total revenue in there. Now I can have these slicers apply to both. So I'm going to create the connection between each of these slicers and the pivot tables. By the way, this is base Excel functionality, so you could do this for multiple pivot tables. It doesn't have to be Power Query. So kind of a neat little function here, but let's go ahead and relate those there. So you could see the number will change on both sides, as I'm kind of clicking through. Well, actually, let's keep that like that. So let's go ahead and add a second measure. I'm going to create one called total expenses. And I'm pasting that in. I'm just going to swap out the word income for expense. Let's add that in there too. Oh, I forgot to format that. So let's edit that. Currency. Much better. Let's go ahead and add COGS in there too. Total COGS. Cost of goods sold. Currency. Cool. So these are basically simple sums, right? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create one called gross profit. This is where things are also get a little bit interesting. I have these formulas for total revenue, total expenses, total COGS. Now I can create a formula on top of these formulas to say basically, give me total revenue minus total COGS. Now I have my gross profit in there. Let's keep going. Why don't we just keep going down the rabbit hole? So at this point we can say gross profit percentage is going to be, well, I want to handle it so that because it might divide by 0, in which case it'll give me an error. I can use an if error function, just like in Excel. It's going to be gross profit divided by total revenue. And if it's an error, just show 0. And that's going to be a percentage. And let's say I want it 1 decimal. So now gross profit percentage is here. And finally, let's go ahead and put in net income. And then this will be basically gross profit minus any operating expenses. And I have my net income in there now. So again, fully kind of dynamic. So as I'm switching through looking at multiple departments and all this kind of good stuff, it will calculate these on the fly. Oh, my Excel kind of crashed. Well, that's great. While we're waiting for my Excel to wake up from its stupor here. Again, so because this is all related in the background in the Power Pivot relationship, after pulling things in from Power Query, all these calculations and computations will just update automatically. It just works basically, except when you're on a webinar and Excel decides to crash. And whoops, yep, there it goes. Now the great thing is because it is context related, you can now pivot on calculations. So it kind of nuked my measures there, so I might have to add them in real quick. I might not do all of them because you kind of already get the point. But let's go ahead and do total revenue equals -1 times calculate sum of amount where the account category is equal to income. And you know what, just for good measure, I'm going to do, yeah, let's do total expenses. Yeah, it's Murphy's Law. It's always like, of course, in a webinar, this decides to kind of stop working on me. Cost of goods sold. And let's just go ahead and just do gross profit. Currency. And we'll do net income. Let's just go and skip over gross profit margin, but gross profit minus total expense. All right, cool. So I have these calculations that I've created from my data model around gross profit, revenue, and all that kind of good stuff. Now, what if I wanted to view things in a slightly different way? So I have my regions here by state. But let's say I wanted to actually have it show by like census region or something like that. I wanted to kind of group it in a different way. But let's say I don't have that data in Business Central itself. What I can do is I can grab that data over the internet and I can bring that into my data model. So if you look at when you go to the get data function, you can actually get from the web itself as well. So let's go ahead and I bookmarked it just to make it easier. On this web page, there's a nice little table that has the state names and the census region, and this is what I want to group by. So I can paste that URL in here. Excel is going to analyze the page and identify anywhere that there's tables. So right now it's parsing it out. It's seeing on this web page, there's basically 2 tables. And when you click on them, it will show the preview on the right rather. And I'm going to go ahead and load this in. Now you can see, you can think already of there's being some use cases out here, like grabbing, an FX rate or a stock ticker value or something like that to constantly be updated. I can come here, remove the other columns because I just want these 2. And when you copy paste from the web, sometimes there's like a whole bunch of like blank spaces and garbage data out there. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do a transformation here. You can capitalize, uppercase, lowercase. I'm just going to click on trim because again, sometimes there's a weird data on the web, and I'm going to call this census regions. I'm going to close and load this. I'm going to close and load it to my data model. Now, hopefully, I think you guys kind of see where I'm going to go with this, but basically now I'm going to go to my data model and I'm going to create a relationship. Notice you don't have to open this page. You can do it from the ribbon there too. I just like showing it here. You can create a relationship between your region name and the census region state. After I do that, you'll notice I'm saving quite a lot now. You can come in here and put in the census region across columns and just by virtue of creating those relationships, having the calculations happen, it just knows. It knows which, which regions each state kind of belongs to. It's kind of magical, really. Yeah, but that's kind of like the way that you can take data that's not even in Business Central, calculations that are not even in Business Central, and by virtue of linking it through all your data that is in Business Central, it just works. Obviously Colorado is just mountain, so that's kind of, that's where the filters come in. But hopefully this makes some semblance of sense. But yeah, you can now report on it by this new census region data that's coming from a web page, really, that kind of groups together your states together. Tables, pivot tables, and tables aren't the only way you can report on You can report in Power Query and Excel. You can obviously put in charts. You can put in all that kind of stuff too. One thing I like to show, because it's just really cool, is power maps, or 3D maps rather. I think they used to call them power maps. And what that will do is I can come in here and let's say I want the bubble graph. My location code, I can pull it from, my region name. And so it recognized that those are states, and you can see it's dotted all the states that I have data from. I could say the size of it is, net income. So the bigger dots are higher net income. I can categorize it further. So let's say I want sales channel name. So it's going to show me now on a map basis, where my income's coming from by sales channel, my net income. And you can even add a time value to here. So I could say posting date. So I could see a little animation of how my distribution of net income is progressing by sales channel, by region. I could kind of scroll past and be like, whoa, there's a lot of yellow at this point. This is in May. Maybe I do a lot of wholesale stuff in that month. And then maybe, there's a lot of blue here in October. Maybe it's a lot of e-commerce stuff happening. Weather's starting to get colder. People don't want to go to the store, so maybe they're ordering online more. A lot of neat things you can do. You don't have to categorize it. You could just do it, have a single kind of dimension. But you can also have it be like a heat map style thing where I'm going to use sales channel again just to kind of show that you can animate it. So if I click on play tour, it can show me over time how things are kind of progressing, across my different regions that I sell to. So really neat functionality. There's a lot of cool things and underexplored things, I think personally, in Excel. A lot of stuff that people never in their lives will even look into. But hopefully this kind of inspires some of that, gets kind of the, the thinking cap running, so kind of seeing how you might leverage some of this functionality in your organizations too. The best part is it's free. If you own an enterprise version of Excel, which I'm assuming most folks on this call do, this functionality is just there. You don't pay any extra licensing. There's nothing extra on that, and it's just there. So that's kind of all I wanted to run through. It's obviously not a deep dive into all the ins and outs of Power Query. It does get even more complex. So we just dealt with queries, but you can create functions. You can do a lot of very powerful things in Power Query. It goes even further if you go into the advanced editor and you actually start crafting some of your own code as well in here. Because like I said, there are two languages in Power Query. One of them is DAX, which we use to create those sums, those calculate measures. But there's also the M language query. So let's say, for example, you wanted to do change it such that you wanted to be able to sort by category, let's say in a pivot table. By default, it'll do it alphabetically, and it'll show assets, then it'll show cost of goods sold, then expense, right? It goes alphabetical, which is not the right sorting order. You can actually create custom columns, and we could create one called sorted category or something like that. And here we could say we could even do something like if account category is equal to assets, then one, something like that, and then else if, we could do something like that, or we could even say like text start number. So we're going to take the first character from the number field, and then we're going to concatenate it with the account category, something like that. And so now you have a sorted category that you can use and pull into a table. And again, every time you click refresh, it's going to go grab the source, going to navigate to the table. It's going to remove those columns. It's going to add that custom column there. It's super powerful, and it will do this across all your queries there, so that you don't have to ever do anything again. You build it once, then you can come in here, and next month you want to look at something, or whatever your timeline may be. You just go to the data tab, you click on refresh all, and then it just goes and grabs the data for you. Just like that. You click on refresh, and it refreshes all your queries. It takes a few seconds, and then it does its thing. Empirically, I found it to be a lot faster than Jet Reports. Not entirely sure why, but I think it's because Jet Reports probably goes through the code unit instead of these OData queries. But in any event, I've just found it to be very kind of fast and responsive, you know, when it's not being watched by folks on a webinar or crashing. But yeah, hopefully that that all makes sense. I know I went through things really fast. I don't have obviously hours to go over this with these webinars, but we're around if you want to reach out. If you want to explore some of the stuff with your data, we're more than happy to kind of get involved in these things. It's your data. You should be entitled to pull the reports the way you want it, consume it how you want it. So I don't know. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox there, but yeah, that's kind of it. So I guess any questions?
Thank you, Ramin.
Yeah, no
Yes, we
problem.
do have a few questions.
Okay.
So the first one is, does this work the same way in NAV 2018 as well? We'll be moving to BC, but not for another 9 to 12 months.
Yeah, that's a great question. It does. That's the beauty of it all. When I first started playing with Power Query was pre-BC. So yeah, Nav 2018 for sure. Most role-tailored client versions of Nav that allow publishing of web services. So definitely 2016 onwards. It does support that. Now, if you wanted to, there's some gotchas with that, right? So if you wanted to refresh over the internet, in other words, if you're not on your server running the Excel reports, then yeah, you may need to put an SSL cert and expose your nav through the internet and all that stuff to then be able to do that. But yeah, no, for sure it works in nav as well on-prem. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. We do have a couple more questions that came through. If anybody has any additional ones, now's the time to get those in. And just as a reminder, yes, I will be sending the recording out to everyone so you can go back through it again or share it with any of your team members at your business. And it will be on our on-demand page as well. So the other question that came through is, our company uses Jet Reports, and with those reports, you can set options when refreshing. Is there something similar in Excel?
Right. So yeah, so with Jet Reports, there's the report option stuff that pops up, when you refresh a report, and you could set those stuff, and then when you click run, it'll use those filters in your to filter out the data and all that stuff. With Power Query, while there isn't a pop-up per se, you can do that, because what you could do is you could have an options, an options tab or something, and you could just insert, you could have basically, let's say option and value, something like that. You could just format this as a table or something like that, and then you could have, like, I don't know, start date and then end date, something like that. And then this table itself can be added to your Power Query, right? So it can grab these values, and then you could create a series of functions that uses this value to do something with the query. You know what? Actually, I do have. Sorry, give me a second. I do have an older Power Query file of mine here. I could show that has something like that. Yeah, so here, for example, and I apologize, this is a really old report. Yeah, 2019 was last when I last refreshed it, where I created this ability that they can, use a drop down or enter something in. You see there's a bunch of hidden rows too. And then I put in a macro where it can refresh it. But ultimately, this table itself becomes part of the report options. And then I have a function that gets a parameter from the report and then sets a date range. So yeah, anyway, sorry, that's a super long-winded way to say, like, yes, in a way. And I don't know, I find it really cool. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you. And the other question is, are you more often using custom developed or stock web services?
That's an excellent question, actually. So honestly, most of the time it's just the stock pages. However, when there's data missing, and when I say missing, it's like well, missing may not be the right term, but let's say, for example, let's look at GL entries. So if you have um, if you have a custom field in the GL entries page, assuming you didn't modify the base page, it might not show up, right? If that's the case, then we create a custom page. However, if you've extended the page itself, it will just show up. So the answer is most of the time, base is just fine. But there are weird occasions where specifically we want to kind of streamline the report or something like that. A good one may be like um, item ledger entries, because there's a lot of them. You might have a page that's based on a temp table that pre-calculates or pre-summarizes your item ledger entries. I just went through this with a client actually recently, where they had too many rows for OData to support, because I think there's a hard cap at some number. So we created a custom page that does the pre-calc, and then that pre-calc is what gets loaded here as kind of the input of the report. And then they took it from there. So I would say it's about like the 80-20 kind of thing. 80% of the time, base objects are just fine. But 20% of the time, we may need to create a custom version to either make it run faster or if there's missing fields. And sorry, and just a kind of addition to that, you probably already know this, but pages are a lot easier to create. They're a lot less invasive, because if you're creating a standalone custom page, you can delete and add that in without any repercussions to your environment, really. So that's one of the great things about these being based off of pages, is that you have a lot of flexibility, less concerns around upgrades or source control management when it comes to pages, because they could be standalone and used single purpose just for Power Query and Power BI reporting.
Okay, great.
Sorry, I tend to ramble. Hopefully that made sense.
The next question is, how is security handled with Power Query reports?
Ooh, good one. Yeah, so that was the one thing that was kind of missing, because I was already logged in. What you didn't see is when you click on OData feed and you paste in the address, it does ask you to sign in. And so whatever permissions you have in Business Central, as a user, those permissions are respected by web services. So if you're not allowed to see something at the time you're refreshing it, you won't be able to see that thing. So all the permissions are intact. Everything is as it is in Business Central. It's all tied to whatever user you log in as at the time that you're getting the report. And let's say I save this report and I send it off to someone. Even though on my machine it caches my authentication, my credentials, when that person that I sent it to opens it up, they'll need to re-sign in. So there's no quote unquote security risk from that perspective, right?
All right, well, I believe those are all the questions that we have for you today. If anybody has any additional questions, feel free to contact your account manager here at Inovia Consulting, or if you'd like to reach out to Ramin, you are welcome to do so. Thank you, Ramin, for the presentation.
Absolutely, it was a pleasure.
And thank you to everyone who has joined, or if you're watching on demand, we thank you for taking the time out to join us. You can also check out our website for more of our upcoming events, and that's inovia.com/events. And our training workshop page is up with our updated workshops. We have a variety of workshops to fit your role, so check out the ones that are right for you and your team. And if you have not heard our latest Inovia Conversation podcast, we have a library of podcast episodes for you to listen to, and you can learn more on our podcast page, and that's anovia.com/podcast. So browse through our selection and subscribe so you'll get notified when those new episodes air. And we have our customer conference coming up in May. Visit our conference page at anovia.com/conferences. The Anovia Customer Conference is a free event for you to attend, so check out our conference page to learn more and register for our event. You can also register for Dynamics Con Live. Both events are back-to-back at the same venue starting on May 21st. So register now so you don't miss out on these great events. All right, thank you again, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Ramin, for the presentation, and we look forward to seeing you soon on another Anovia webinar. Take care, everyone.